Broken promises are hurtful. Imagine you have a birthday party and you ask your friends to come, and some say they will, but then they don't show up. Or maybe a little girl is waiting at school for her dad who doesn't come for hours. A nonprofit that's planning this event to help people, but the volunteers, they don't end up showing up either. You see, broken promises have a cost to this world. They are disappointing, they're hurtful. What if you could know that a promise was going to be broken when someone made it? Like before it was ever broken, you actually knew in advance. What if you had like a little machine or something? I mean, what if that was possible? I mean, biologically speaking, is that possible? Before we go into how to handle broken promises, let's ask that question, and let's look at some research behind the science of broken promises as well. You see, some researchers from Switzerland, the University of Zurich's Laboratory for Social and Neural Systems Research, they had some researchers there who wanted to understand, could you predict broken promises? Now, because I said I would, has presented a bunch of research, and of course it relates to commitment and promises, doing the right thing. But I want you to know that this research is 100% directly tied to promises. I mean, the actual title of the published research is The Neurocircuitry of Broken Promises. Let's talk about that. See, the premise of this study that these researchers did is actually focused on a game designed to create actions that would create brain activity. They wanted to track that brain activity and see what they could learn from it. So let's talk about the three main people who are actually involved in this game and in this study. In this game, there are three main actors: the bank, Bobby, and Scott. Now, this game has 12 rounds. That's important to remember. But let's go into the first action. The very first thing that happens in this game is that the bank gives Bobby $2, okay? Now, Bobby has a choice. He can give $1 to Scott or $2 to Scott, but something interesting happens. If he gives $1 to Scott, the bank will multiply that fivefold. You see, every dollar he gives, it'll be multiplied fivefold. So if he decides to give $1 to Scott, then Bobby's actually giving $5 because of the bank multiple, and then $2 would, of course, equal 10. Now, you might ask yourself, why would somebody give money, right? Why wouldn't Bobby just keep the $2? Well, you see, Scott has the option in this game, in the next action, to give back money to Bobby, to show appreciation, to show trust. And that's meaningful because there's 12 rounds to this game. This is not the end of it, right? These are just actions inside of one round. So where does the promise come in though? Well, I just explained the basic rules of the game that was performed with no promises. They did exactly that in this study, but they also did a version of the game with promises in it, and they compared the two. So I just explained the one with no promises. Let's get into the version that explains the one with promises. Okay, you see, at the beginning of this 12-round game with promises, Scott is told that he must make a promise in round one that he will either never, sometimes, mostly, always, one of those options, pay back half of the money received no matter what Bobby does. And that promise will last for 3 rounds of the 12 rounds. Then Scott can make a new promise if he would like. Now, Scott is asked to make this promise, but he is free to keep the promise if he wants or to break it. You see, it makes the game very interesting because think about that. Scott is making a promise, and he certainly knows he's going to make, or he's either going to break this promise or keep it. And not in like 3 months from now or 3 days from now, like literally in 30 seconds. He's going to know what he's going to do. So let's see how that plays out. Let's say that Bobby and Scott go through round one, just like we went through in the previous example. Bobby gets 2 units from the bank. He takes his 2 units, gives it to Scott. Because he gives it to Scott, the bank multiplies it by 5-fold. So ultimately, Scott gets 10 units. Scott sees this generosity, loves it, gives back 5 units to Bobby, and they're even. You see, right now, there's nothing different about this version with promises and no promises. But what becomes more interesting is the second round. You see, the second round, now Bobby has some trust with Scott, and he knows that Scott has made a promise to always give him half the money in the next 3 rounds. So what does Bobby logically do? Well, he trusts Scott. he gives both units in round 2. He gives both those dollars to Scott. Now Scott has 10 more units, 15 units total. And in those 10 units that he can give possibly back to Bobby, he starts thinking. Scott thinks, I like this money, and I'm not going to give him half. You see, this is where broken promises comes in. Scott decides, you know what? I don't care about promises. Scott decides of the 10 units he just received, he's only going to give 3 back to Bobby as a gesture. Scott justifies this broken promise because it's more than Bobby would have gotten anyway, right? Yes, that is true, but it is not keeping the promise. The promise was half, which would have been $5. You see, this entire game's construction, the purpose of this study is to see what happens in Scott's brain. These scientists wanted to see through this MRI scanning machine to see if they could accurately predict when Scott makes that promise, if he's going to break it or not. Even before the promise is broken, even before that, could they accurately predict it? And the answer is yes. You see, the MRI machine reads brain activity, and when someone makes a promise they know they're going to break, the anterior cingulate cortex and both left and right frontoinsular cortices light up. Now, you don't actually have to know what all of that means as far as the part of the brains. All you need to know is that they light up when someone's being dishonest. And in this game, when people are being honest and keeping their promises, it doesn't light up. That means that scientists can accurately predict whether or not people are going to make or break promises in certain instances. And these findings are further validated by other research that has been done on dishonesty and lying and emotional conflict, because in those cases, the same areas of the brain light up as well. This research suggests that breaking promises and lying aren't only philosophically related and associated, but they are biologically similar. But the truth is, lying is almost always intentional, right? I guess lying in its definition has intent. But breaking promises, it's not always that way. Let's say, for example, someone promises to run a marathon for cancer research to benefit that. And even in honor of someone they love who's passed away, a very serious promise. They train for this promise, but 2 days before that race, they get in a serious car accident. They're not able to walk for some weeks and thus are unable to run this marathon. Is that intentional? Is that broken promise intentional like this game? No, it is not. You see, even with the best of intentions, sometimes promises can be broken, and that is reality. We need to accept that is part of reality. We need to accept that is part of life. And that is why we need to know how to handle broken promises. Let's talk about how to handle broken promises in 2 ways. One, the promises that you might make that end up getting broken for good or bad reasons. And then 2, a promise that was made to you that someone else broke, right? Those are 2 different things. And let's get into the first one. When you have to face that moment where you've broken a promise, we believe there are 6 steps. Certainly not a perfect science, but let's go into that. A lot of people think the first step is just jump into an apology, right? But there are some best practices that I think will actually handle the situation a little bit better. And the first step to handling that broken promise of yours is to plan. So what kind of promise are you going to make in response to this broken promise, right? A lot of times a knee-jerk reaction out of people will be to just make a bigger promise, right? Try to make up for it. But sometimes this isn't the right thing to do, right? You might be actually in a situation where you've broken that promise because of overcommitting. Or maybe you're not capable in some way of fulfilling this promise and you didn't know that. So making a bigger promise to make up for things sometimes is the absolute wrong thing to do. The second thing, and is also intuitive, is to make the same level of promise, the same promise. The third thing is to make a smaller promise, but we have to also consider the fourth option, which is making no promise at all. Maybe the promise cannot be made up for, or maybe that you are too committed and you have too much going on to truly fulfill this commitment. Again, it's a harsh reality, but regardless of what level you're promising at, it's really important to create a plan to actually document what your promise is and how you're going to keep it, and that'll come in later. Now, you might think the second step is apology, and I still don't think it's quite there yet. In the second step, it's actually to prepare mentally for that accountability. And what do I mean by that? We kind of have to take our broken promises on the chin, right? We have to know that the person may not say nice things, and it might get a little harsh. And in that moment, are we going to hold ourselves accountable, or are we going to start to make excuses? Are you going to accept personal responsibility in the heat of that moment, or are you going to kind of cave and try to talk around it? That's why we've got to prepare mentally. You want to act how you'd want others to act when they break promises with you, and that's just to be honest and to accept accountability. The third step is that apology step, and it's kind of following a sentence structure, right? It's best done face to face. Let's point that out first. Hiding behind text messages and emails isn't a good way to maintain good relationships when broken promises happen. But the first thing is to say, I am sorry. The second is to say, I should have. The third is to say, I didn't do this. And the fourth is to really verbatim say, I broke a promise. Take accountability that way. So let me give an example. I made a commitment to one of our greatest volunteers, Pat, who spends so much time helping us out. We were going to go to see a movie. She hadn't seen a movie in a very, very long time. And so I said, okay, well, we'll go see a movie together, Pat, and I'm going to be there at 6:45. Well, I went to the wrong movie theater. So now I got to go to the right movie theater, and I just make it on the nick of time, but I'm late according to the meeting time that I promised to be there for. So what the best thing to do in this example would be to say, I'm sorry, Pat. I should have been here 15 minutes ago. I didn't do that because I didn't plan correctly, and I broke a promise to you to be on time. Now, in this case, I fell to a weakness that we just talked about, which is I started to describe the fact that I didn't read my calendar and I went to the wrong place first and I tried. The better thing would be to just say, I made a mistake, and just stick a little bit with this sentence structure. The fourth step in how to handle these broken promises is to listen and stay consistent. Because in this example of Pat and her disappointment, I don't want to just keep talking. I want to listen and hear what they have to say. That person who you broke a promise with has a right to be disappointed. And so you've got to listen and hear that and resist that urge to stress reasons too much or excuses, whatever we want to call them. Try to avoid those. Just listen and stick with your apology that's more straightforward. The fifth step is to communicate that new level of commitment that in step one we planned for, right? It's not just a knee-jerk reaction. We actually had a plan, and so we're going to communicate that now and kind of stay committed to it. Now, in some instances, maybe during this dialogue, we hear about what happens, the consequences of our actions, and maybe new information comes in where we do want to step up that level of commitment. That can happen, but in most instances, we've already contemplated, we already thought about what we should do, and we should probably stick with that plan, again, in most instances. The sixth thing is to show that plan. Really give them more confidence. Show that you've documented it. Even if this is just a text verification, an email, or maybe show on your calendar that it's kind of booked out and those steps are thought of. Explain maybe even what might go wrong in your plan so that there's better expectations on what could realistically happen in this commitment, and then ask that person to check in with you. Those are the 6 steps for when you break a promise. Plan, prepare for accountability, apologize, listen and stay consistent with that apology. Then you're going to communicate that new level of commitment, and finally show the plan. Now let's talk about when someone breaks a promise with you. It's almost the opposite of the model that we just went through with a slight variation for the different role. When someone breaks a promise with you, the first thing you should do is ask why the promise was broken. I take a policy of innocent until proven guilty here, because remember that unfortunate circumstances beyond anyone's control can happen, like in the marathon example we gave earlier. But before you really know why the promise was broken, you want to be careful with your tone to make sure that you're allowing the person to explain things without too much judgment. The next is to listen and be reasonable to what they say to you about this broken promises. Because yes, hard to predict things can happen, and a certain amount of human error should be understandable, but remember that accountability does matter. So we're not saying all the softness of how we're handling this situation to avoid accountability. No, it's just to be careful before we know the facts. We know the facts, then we hold the person accountable to the next step, which we'll talk about, but accountability does matter. The third step is to communicate the consequences of that broken promise. This is more of that accountability. Talk about what happened, what was negatively influenced by that broken promise. Stick with the facts of it. Certainly, you can also communicate your personal emotions and feelings and how you were hurt, but avoid and limit accusations about that person's intent. Now, if you have a long history of broken promises, maybe you do make some comments about what you believe their intent should be, but generally you're trying to avoid or limit that and just stick with the facts of the situation, because people tend to respect that a lot more than the assumptions that someone could make after being hurt. The fourth step is to communicate that new level of commitment, whatever level it may be at. Ask for that. The person may not offer a level of commitment. That's why it's important to ask. And you remember the 4 levels that we discussed earlier. The fifth step is to ask for that plan. You do have a right to see that to some degree. It's not all about distrust and the thought that this isn't going to happen. It's also about accountability and good contemplation, good planning. And asking for that, I think, is reasonable in most circumstances. Finally, number 6 is to hold that person accountable. And it's not in a punitive way, but in a supportive one. Schedule time, perhaps in your schedule, to reach back out to them, to check in, but use that supportive tone. It can be hard to be supportive, but you'll catch more bees with honey than vinegar, or whatever that saying is. Those are the 6 steps. When someone breaks a promise with you, first, ask why the promise was broken. Second, listen and be reasonable. Third, communicate the consequences of the broken promise. Fourth, ask for that new level. Then ask to see a plan. Finally, hold the person accountable. There is a twist in all of this, though. In the emotions of a broken promise, it is quite possible that the person on the other end of the broken promise who is hurt could not allow any of this to happen. They could totally shut it down. Remember that it is hurtful, and some people see it as dishonesty, which in some cases research has shown that it is exactly that. They might be completely fed up with you. You may be completely fed up with someone else. That is an absolute possibility in some cases. That's why it's so important to be a person of your word. Broken promises have a tremendous cost on society, on humanity, but in our personal lives as well. And when we look at the betterment of humanity, living in honor, keeping our word, it can bring so much good into our lives, into society. I believe it is essential, it is key to keep promises. Fortunate part about that is that each and every one of us were born with the ability to build a little bit greater self-control, build a little bit greater determination to do what is right. And that's what I challenge you to do. But finally, we have a lot of hope, but at some point, with enough broken promises, with enough broken trust, there is no clever advice, there is no model or process, there's no tips or tricks that can help. Once trust is lost at a certain point, there's nothing you can do. Think about that.